For more on the Iran war, we are joined this morning by Yánnis Varoufakis. He, of course, is an economist. He's a best-selling author. He's former Greek finance minister and also host of the podcast, The Econoclass. Great to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Very good to see you again.
Yeah, of course. So just off the top here, your reaction to the purported goals, to the best we know them, of this war and how this all seems to be going.
Well, it is going abysmally for Donald Trump, whatever his goals were. It is a war that he started without much of a strategy regarding how he's going to end it. This is not new, of course. It harks back to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. There is a very long tradition of the United States pursuing its strategy of forever war on behalf of the military-industrial complex. It works really very well for those who are selling guns and bombs and missiles. It doesn't work very well for the American people. It doesn't work at all well for the rest of the world. So, on the altar of a forever war that suits the military-industrial complex and now the AI industrial complex or military complex, we are caught in a conundrum that is jeopardizing the well-being of the vast majority of the human species. And we have a Donald Trump who is slowly realizing that he has fallen headlong into a trap of his own making. My assessment is that Trump was actually winning on all fronts up until he made that ridiculous decision, essentially to fall into Netanyahu's trap of, fighting Netanyahu's war. And from now on, there is nothing can save Donald Trump politically.
One of the things we wanted to talk to you about, Yánnis, in particular is your expertise with respect to Europe, many of the other U.S. allies. We have been stunned already to see an almost total rejection by the United States request for assistance in the Strait of Hormuz. Guys, we can go ahead and put B1 up here on the screen. We have a summary of all of the U.S. allies. Japan says it currently does not plan to dispatch naval vessels. We can go to the next one. Australia said it will not do so. South Korea says we will not do so. The United Kingdom said they will not be drawn into a war with Iran. The European foreign ministers said they will discuss it, but are not expected to expand its role. The Germans explicitly say they will not participate. The Danes saying that they, ahead of the EU meeting, it would be wise to keep an open mind. But as a small country, we are not as a small country, large maritime nation, but we don't expect to do so. Italy, and then of course Greece as well, says it will not engage in military operations. It's pretty stunning to say that not even a single one of these people are willing to step up. I'm curious for your reaction as to why this time they're willing to stand up to the United States and what it means for the U.S. and for Europe.
I wish you were right that they were standing up against the United States. They're simply refusing to do, to send ships to a suicide mission, to a mission that is bound to fail. Because let's face it, even if all those naval vessels of every possible, flag from Japan all the way to Norway, were to accumulate, to amass at the Strait of Hormuz. This is a very asymmetrical situation. The Iranians only need, to send one or two drones past these vessels, and they will succeed in what they are interested in, which is to make sure that the insurance costs of these vessels are so high that it's uneconomical for them even to try to pass the straits. But, where I disagree, and I wish you were right, is that our European leaders, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Australians, are standing up to the United States. They're not doing no such thing. So, take Chancellor Merz of Germany, a typical example of someone lacking the moral spine and the intelligence to oppose Donald Trump, Washington, D.C. On the one hand, he says, we're not going to take part in this. Of course, they won't take part in this. But at the same time, he allows Ramstein, the largest American military base in Germany, to be used in order to bombard a United Nations member state and to therefore, become complicit. Germany is complicit in the violation of international law. The Brits are doing the same thing with their bases in Cyprus. The Arab states, they still maintain the United States military on their ground, and therefore they're opening themselves up to missile and drone attacks by Iran. My country, Greece, our pathetic government, sent a frigate and F-16s to Cyprus to do what? To protect the British sovereign ground of the Akrotiri base, which the United States has been using in order to attack Iran illegally. So our governments are quite pathetic. Let me be very straightforward on this. On the one hand, they are complicit in the United States attack on Iran. They may not like it, but they are complicit. They're choosing to be complicit in it. And on the other hand, they say, well, we're not going to send any vessels to achieve the unachievable.
I'm curious for your view on the likely economic fallout. We can put B3 up on the screen. This was an analysis for the GCC member states. Goldman Sachs predicts that if this war goes on another 2 months, they're going to see massive falls in their GDP, Qatar and Kuwait in particular. But obviously, there are global implications for the Strait continuing to be more or less closed, reverberations throughout all of the economies of the world. What do you expect if this war continues to drag on, as it appears likely to do, given that Iran has projected that they are nowhere near ready to pursue a ceasefire?
Well, you don't need to be an economic genius to know that the Gulf states, their business model is finished, that the United States and Israel have killed it. They've killed their economies. And it's not something that has just begun now. Let's not forget that this has been happening now for 5-6 years. Remember when Trump, in the dying days of his first administration, took out a military commander of Iran, Soleimani. Soleimani was just about to meet his Saudi Arabian counterpart to strike a deal, a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. After that, essentially what the Americans, with the support and the egging on of Israel, were trying to do was to stop a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That didn't work because a couple of years later, it was the United Arab Emirates that opened an embassy in Tehran. Later on, it was Qatar. It was even Saudi Arabia in 2023. Essentially, Israel has been at it now for 5-6 years. And what do I mean by being at it? They've been trying to ensure that there's no détente between the Emirates, between the Gulf states and Iran. And, that's the main reason why they entrapped Donald Trump into this attack on Iran at the cost of decimating the business model of the Gulf states. Netanyahu has succeeded with the complicity, explicit thinking. I don't know whether it was something that Trump understood that he was doing, but nevertheless, he was playing the Netanyahu game of wrecking both the détente between Iran and the Gulf states and the Gulf state economies. But since you're asking me about the economic implications are awful in your own country. I mean, if you are a MAGA blue-collar worker driving 150 miles a day to go to your bullshit job in order to make ends meet, and you have to pay these gas prices, you're destroyed. I mean, Trump came out the other day with an inane comment that the United States is a net oil and gas producer, which is true. And therefore, he said, since, we are a net exporter, if the price of fossil fuels goes up, we make more money. Well, who are you to say that?
Yeah, who makes
have you asked your own base? Are they shareholders in Chevron? Are they shareholders in Exxon? They're not. They, things were bad enough. They elected you because of the unaffordability crisis. And now affordability has gone into the dustbin of history. And it's not just that. Last year, I was one of the commentators, economists, politicians who were arguing that, that his tariffs were not that big a deal, unlike other economists who were pulling their hair out. Maybe it's because I don't have much hair. I wasn't pulling mine out over the tariffs. And the reason why those tariffs, and you remember the Liberation Day spasm in the stock markets, didn't last long. And very soon after that, markets were gung-ho again, and they became bullish again. Well, the reason is because back then, the situation was very different to what it is now. the war that he has unleashed against Iran, even if it ends today, is going to have long-term effects. The damage is permanent. It is not temporary. It's not like Liberation Day. Remember last year you had, in your country, the United States, you had a massive wave of investment due to AI. Well, this is going to be stemmed now. Why? Because AI is very energy intense, very energy hungry. And with energy going through the roof, the AI investment spree is severely circumscribed. Then at the same, there's another element to this. Last year, this time, around Liberation Day, if you remember, the Fed was in the process of cutting interest rates. Not as fast as Donald Trump wanted them, but they were cutting interest rates. Well, now, with yields going through the roof, 10-year bond yields in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Frankfurt, in Brussels, in Tokyo, all the West's central banks are either slowing down the rate at which they're cutting interest rates, or they're actually going to start increasing them. We already saw in Australia an increase in interest rates. So, this is a perfect storm. You have energy going up, AI investment tapering, interest rates going up. As I said, even if the war stops today, which it can't, because, Donald Trump has no way of de-escalating unless he opens the Strait of Hormuz, which the Iranians are never going to allow, because the Iranians, they felt an existential crisis. They were attacked. Their leader, whatever you may think of Khamenei, he was the leader of a member state of the United Nations, and he was murdered by the Israelis and the Americans. And they are saying no. I mean, we're not going to let you come back at us. We are going to bring you down, and even if it means bringing down the Gulf states, even if it means damaging significantly Bangladesh and India. These are countries, and South Korea. These are countries that rely on the natural gas and the oil that goes through the Straits of Hormuz. So, Donald Trump, like George W. Bush before him, like LBJ in the 1960s, has been caught into a trap of his own making, and he doesn't know how to wriggle out of it.
Yánnis, you have described this previously as a breakdown in the neoliberal economic order. What do you see exactly the different pieces that make this happen?
Well, this breakdown goes back to 2008, to the great financial collapse, to Lehman Brothers. American-led dollarized capitalism never recovered fully from 2008. You have to remember that between 2008 and the end of the pandemic in 2022, the central banks of the West pumped out $35 trillion. That is $35,000 billion. That was quantitative easing, if you remember, while at the same time imposing austerity to the vast majority of people in the United States, in Europe, in Britain. So if you have this combination of austerity for the many, which depresses demand, and therefore, in turn, the secondary effect is that it depresses investment in productive machines, in real stuff. And at the same time, you print 35 trillion and you give it to the financiers who give it to big business that use it to buy back their own shares. So asset prices go up, but there's no investment. And the only people who invest in this world of ours, essentially, are the Chinese on one hand and big tech on the other, who are not producing anything except the power through, Amazon.com and Uber and so on, to reach deep into your pockets and take money out, which it then is not invested into productive capacity. It is invested into more machines that create more power for the Jeff Bezos of the world to put their long arms deeply into your pocket. You realize that this is not a sustainable macroeconomy. And the result is that, we have stagnation in the West. The carnage that Donald Trump said he saw in, the working classes of the United States, which was there. He did have a point when he was raising this. Of course, now he's making it far worse. He invoked that sense of carnage amongst blue-collar workers to get elected to the White House in order to enrich big tech and the military-industrial complex and, essentially promote the agenda of Benjamin Netanyahu and his forever wars in the Middle East.
Let me get your reaction to something that Ray Dalio was writing about. So he says his reading of history and sense of what is happening now leads him to believe that if the U.S. were to lose in this way, and that way specifically being unable to retake control of the Strait of Hormuz, there would be a significant risk that losing control of Hormuz would be for the U.S. what the Suez Canal crisis was for Great Britain in 1956, and analogous defeats were for the Dutch Empire in the 18th century and the Spanish Empire in the 17th century. The pattern of events that leads to the breakdown of empires is almost always the same. Do you see this war with Iran as existential for the U.S. empire and the current existing world order?
I think it's far-fetched to make such gross predictions at the moment. Let's not forget that we've had many prognostications in the past of the demise of America's hegemony in the late 1960s, when America, for the first time after the 1900s, went from being a surplus country to being a deficit country. When Richard Nixon in August of 1971 blew up the Bretton Woods system, which was the pride and joy of American politicians and American financiers and American diplomats and economists. Again, back then, in the late 60s, early 70s, people were prognosticating the end of American hegemony. America has lost almost every war that it has waged since Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Every war, begins with claims of mission accomplished, and then very soon after that ends up in a quagmire from which the United States extricates itself sometimes with, sometimes very ignominiously. Remember the helicopter departing from the American embassy in Saigon, or similarly under Biden from Kabul. Mm-hmm. So let's not rush into conclusions. There's no doubt that, all empires at some point collapse or wane. It's true about all the empires that you mentioned, the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire. But the American Empire has shown a remarkable capacity to increase its hegemony at the same time as it depletes its soft power as well as its industry. After 1971, we had a remarkable phenomenon, and this is the result of the Nixon shock of August 1971. America went deeper into the red, and the more into the red the United States went, both in terms of its trade deficit and its federal budget deficit, the more hegemonic it became. That has never happened before to any empire. Every empire that got into the red very soon after that waned and died. The United States didn't, because of the power, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, because, sometimes this is a paradox, but it ceases to be a paradox once we start looking into it. People talk to me about de-dollarization and the way in which the dollar is going to be thrown off its throne. Well, I ask them the question, okay, now, what is it that keeps the dollar hegemonic today? And the answer is, its enemies. So, China doesn't want to see the dollar being dethroned. Why? Because they have $4.5 trillion in savings. So, if you had your savings in a Swiss bank account, would you want to see Swiss banks go under? No, you wouldn't. So, the Chinese are the real adults in the room at the moment, and they're doing whatever it takes in order to stop Trump from destroying American hegemony. Not because they are philanthropic towards the Americans, but because, they have their savings in US dollars for the time being. They are slowly shifting their savings away from it. Now, when a significant part of the world, including Saudi Arabia, including India, and so on, shift their savings away from the dollar system, that's when the American empire will start withering.
Lastly, sir, from me on a different but related matter, Cuba is being threatened directly by Trump. He says, I'm just going to take it. Their electrical grid has reportedly suffered a complete and total collapse, according to the country's power operator. Obviously, this puts, thousands of people's lives at risk. The island is effectively under a U.S.-led embargo, doing to them somewhat of what we did in Gaza as well. What do you make of what is happening to Cuba right now, what we're doing to Cuba right now, and how this fits into whatever Trump's aims are around the world?
the Trump administration is committing a crime, an international violation of international law and basic, moral standards by what it is doing to Cuba. Whatever you may think of the Cuban regime, it is clear that given that it doesn't have any support from anywhere, long gone are the days when Cuba could rely on the Soviet Union, China, Russia. They may pay lip service to Cuba. The fact that the people of Cuba remain broadly in support of the system of government that they have, broadly in support, with a lot of criticisms and a lot of moaning and groaning and so on. But nevertheless, the fact that this regime is in Cuba is still there just goes to show that it does have still support. The idea that somehow to go back to the pre-Castro era would be liberation is an abomination. Remember that before Castro's revolution, Cuba was effectively annexed by the mafia, by prostitution, by drug cartels, and so starving a whole population in order to force them to overthrow a government that does have an intertemporal support is just an awful abomination of a crime. Now, Gaza, of course, is going to stigmatize our generation, independently of our politics. In the next 100, 200 years, people will think of us as a generation which allowed the genocide in Gaza to continue, and to continue even after a supposed ceasefire, because it's going on as we speak now, by other means, through starvation, through denying them. They're still operating on children without anesthetics, because the Israeli army does not allow, as we speak, anesthetics to go into Gaza.
Unbelievable. Well, it may not take an economic genius to figure out some aspects here, like oil prices going up is going to be bad, but we're very fortunate and glad to have an economic genius to help us sort through these many things. Yánnis Varoufakis, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.